Welcome to Crawlspace. I am Lance. I'm sure all of you out there were expecting to hear Tim's voice right there at the top, but I am flying solo on this intro, and I am very excited about the guest that we have on today. We have been a fan of this individual for many years, and we couldn't be more excited to have him on to discuss all of his Bigfoot research that he has done over the past decade or so. This is John Baranchok. And for 17 years, he had his own neuropsychology practice. And from that, he spent 2 years working at the Rome Veterans Administration Outreach Clinic as a clinical psychologist. But for almost a decade now, he has dedicated his time to learn more about this phenomenon we know as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. He has written a new book called Grasping Sasquatch, which he talks about today. He's also a wealth of information, a wealth of stories, and he's got some good ones here. And his approach to discovering more about this elusive creature is from a scientific standpoint, how to properly prepare yourself if you ever have one of these Class B experiences, which is indications of Bigfoot being around you, not quite seeing Bigfoot, maybe seeing footprints, how to handle those psychologically so that when you do have that Class A experience, coming face to face with Bigfoot, then you'll know how to properly handle that. So, without further ado, we're going to break real quick for a commercial here, and we'll be right back with Dr. John Baranchok and his world of Bigfoot. Please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Dr. John Baranchok, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Great. Thank you. How are you guys?
We're doing excellent. This is a great moment in our podcasting history. We finally landed you on the show, so we're so thrilled to have you. Can't wait to talk to you about everything that you're an expert in. But for those out there who do not know who the great John Baranchok is, could you please fill the listeners in?
My name is John Baranchok. I've got a PhD in counseling psychology and had a private practice and worked in a hospital in neuropsychology for 24 years. Towards the end of my private practice, before I started working for the Veterans Administration, I was looking for a place to fish and came across a BFRO map. That's how I got involved in Bigfoot. I went on a BFRO expedition looking for some trout fishing. I've been hooked ever since. My medical condition took me out for about 2 years, but this is my 7th year doing it. And when I calculated up the number of hours, not camping, but actually walking around the woods looking for Bigfoot, it comes to over 300 hours of boots on the ground at night in the forest looking for Bigfoot. That inspired me to write my book to begin with.
I just want to let you know that your pun was appreciated, that you were out trout fishing and you got hooked. So I don't know if that was an intentional pun, but we appreciate it here.
I was telling Tim, 8 years ago, I was living and going to school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, University of New Mexico. Went up to the Jemez Springs Mountains. Just across the mountain from Jemez Springs, I don't remember the name of the caldera, but it's the caldera in which Los Alamos is located. I would go up there and fish this trout stream, and as I'm working my way down from one hole to the next, it's like a cascading river going from one rocky pool cascading into another. I'd throw my bait in. You could see the fish. I'd throw my bait in, and all of a sudden a big rock would come into the hole that I was fishing and ploosh, ruin the fishing in that hole. So I'd move down to the next hole, and the same thing was repeated. And I started yelling at it, thinking it was some jerk kind of just following me and harassing my fishing, but it just kept happening and I never saw a thing. And it really wasn't until I got into Bigfoot that I kind of started to piece that together a little bit as a good possibility. I think it was probably a Bigfoot messing with my fishing, but I can't prove that because I never saw a thing, but sure had lots of rocks thrown at my fishing areas.
Now, have you heard that that's something that Bigfoot does occasionally?
throwing things, yes. I had never heard of it intentionally disturbing an activity like fishing. I guess if you buy into the image of Bigfoot as stewards of the forest and protectors of the wildlife, that would kind of fit with that. I can't help but wonder if it was protecting its own fishing hole and food supply. And trying to shoo me off rather than protect the fish.
There was a time in my life where I actually thought I would be a good fly fisherman, and my friends and I took up fly fishing, and I caught a total of 0 fish during this year and a half of my life. So I will now attribute that to Bigfoot and not just me being a poor fisherman. Thank you.
Yeah, I've got 2 fly fishing poles, but I've never had any luck with them. My daughter's name is Sedona, after Sedona, Arizona. We went out there and I hired a trout fishing guide out in Sedona, fly fishing only. And I had 1 bite and lost the fish. And I fish, with a spinning outfit and a bobber or just no bobber and go that way.
Fly fishing is so difficult.
Yeah.
I'm too clumsy. But I will say I'm an expert at getting knots out of anything now.
Yeah, that's easy enough to learn pretty quick.
Okay, so that was your first Bigfoot experience. Have you had others?
My very first expedition was with Lori Wade, who's a BFRO expedition leader. Somehow, even though I wasn't an investigator, she allowed me to come on to her last outing of that year, which was an investigator's outing. That was in northern Georgia. I ended up having a flat tire and sitting by the road trying to be rescued, and my truck had the wheel locks on it, but they never gave me the key to unlock the wheel to change the tire when I bought my vehicle. So I was sitting there on the side of the road, and finally, lo and behold, coincidentally, one of the guys from the expedition that I was scheduled to be on stopped by and helped me out. Long story short, I ended up arriving late to the expedition till we finally got my truck into the shop. It ended up taking like 14 hours to get that tire off without a lock key. So I had this guy by the name of Jeff Carpenter, who is just an awesome investigator, Bigfoot investigator, kind of taxi me around. At any rate, I didn't go out that first night because I got to camp late and was pretty stressed. But the next night I went out. That night, my first, authentic Bigfoot encounter was confirmed by somebody else. And we heard a Bigfoot cut loose with a big roar, and it was across the river valley from where we were posted up looking for Bigfoot. And I heard that roar, and one of the 3 guys that I was with thought we had a Bigfoot throw a stick from the bottom of the cliff that we were stationed on up on top of it. And so I had to take the word of the other folks that was a Bigfoot encounter, because although I could hear the Bigfoot growl, what happened was some coyotes started cutting loose and howling, and then you heard the big Bigfoot growl above it all. I had never heard a Bigfoot growl. I was still pretty skeptical. Fast forward to an expedition in Tennessee. That's one of my 2 or 3 kind of butt-puckering encounter stories that I experienced. Would this be a good time to discuss that?
I just have one question before you do that, though. You mentioned a couple of times Bigfoot roar, Bigfoot growl. So my question is, what exactly does a Bigfoot roar sound like and a Bigfoot growl, and how is that different from like a bear or something like that?
So I've heard both a growl and a roar. The roar sounded a lot like a growl, but with a lot more volume and force than the roar. But it was just, a kind of sound. And the first time I heard that came from across a valley, 8-10 miles away. You could hear that roar above the coyotes. The other story I'll tell you, there was a Bigfoot behind a bush at 90 feet from me rustling a bush. I got a softer version of that, and that's my second butt-puckering kind of story. I guess I'll start with that one since I'm on that one already. Lori is nice enough to bring in speakers on every one of her expeditions. Like the second expedition I was on with her, she brought in Scott Carpenter. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his name. He's a Bigfoot researcher who wrote some books called Nephilim Among Us and Nephilim Among Us Revisited. And he believes that Bigfoot is a fallen angel cast out by Christ when he cast out Satan and the other fallen angels. He believes Bigfoot is the product of the fallen angels coming to Earth and trying to corrupt humanity by having sex with females to corrupt the genetic pool, if you will, of humanity. And so he was talking about that, shared some of his experiences. He was not behind the scenes, he was the on-camera guide for Les Stroud's Survivor Man's Bigfoot series. On that series, he told us that they had a Bigfoot materialize and dematerialize right in front of their eyes on film, and Les asked that to be kept out for fear how appearing and disappearing act might affect his reputation and his viewers' view of him. That ended up on the cutting room floor. The point being, that was the first time I was introduced to this notion of Bigfoots being able to cloak or disappear. I've got a federal wildlife management area 50 minutes from my house called Johns Mountain Wildlife Management Area. I went out there about a month after my expedition that Scott Carpenter was on. The thing Scott Carpenter, and I think an awesome thing that he's best known for, when he hikes a trail looking for Bigfoot, instead of having his GoPro cameras facing in front of him to capture what he's hiking up on, he turns his GoPro cameras around behind him and records what's sneaking up on him from behind. And I was never afraid of going into the woods until I got his book. And in his book, he's got the original GoPro capture. Then he cleaned it up and fiddled with it. And then he had an artist draw a rendition of that capture for the most clarity. And some of the things that his raw captures and enhanced captures showed really scared me. I grew up in the country, had a rod and gun club behind our house, didn't hunt, but fished my whole life as a kid. So I was used to being in the woods. And when I saw those images, it put the fear of God in me, even though I was really skeptical about this whole cloaking thing and it being a demon. Nonetheless, I went out to Johns Mountain and found a place I thought looked squatchy. At that point, I was still looking to learn what constitutes a squatchy area. And I found this multiple campsite, and it had ridges coming down on both sides of the group campsite. Those formed kind of a corridor 3 or 4 miles back to a mountain. And there was a stream running along one side that fed into the main river. And that seemed to have everything that I had come to know that you want, for a squatchy area. So I stayed there. My dog and I, during the daylight, we scoped out along the creek looking for prints, looking for any Bigfoot sign. We didn't see any. So we came back as the sun was beginning to set, got a campfire going, started cooking dinner. And as I was wrapping up dinner, I had recently adopted a pit bull mix. Given that I was by myself, I decided to bring my dog. I was advised not to squatch by myself. I had my dog on a long rope, probably about a 50-foot rope tied to a tree. And he was laying down as I was finishing up dinner close to the fire. And all of a sudden, he stuck his nose straight up in the air, perpendicular to the sky. And he sat there and sniffed for about 5 minutes, just frozen in that posture. And when he was frozen in that posture, I didn't know what was up because I'd never seen him do this. But after 5 minutes, he brought his head down and started barking and growling and snarling and acting like he was seeing or sensing something right in front of us within the entrance to this group camp area, but I couldn't see a thing. So his name was Red. So I said, okay, Red, let's go check it out. I went and got my headlamp and I got him on a leash and I said, come on, Red, let's go. He just scurried under the trailer. He wouldn't move forward from our campfire. So I said, well, okay, I guess I'm going to have to do this by myself. So I started walking out there, and as much as I was a skeptic about Bigfoot being interdimensional or being able to move from one dimension to another or cloak or change, change its molecular activity so it disappeared, I was skeptical of all that. And I remain open to that. I don't believe in it and I don't disbelieve in that aspect of Bigfoot. I think it needs to be scientifically investigated. But anyways, this was just a month after I heard Scott Carpenter talk about them being able to cloak and disappear. So as I moved forward, it was about 15, 20 feet from where my campfire was to the opening of this camping area. As I walked forward, I put my hands out in front of me as I was walking for fear I was going to walk into a cloaked Bigfoot, right in front of me, because my dog was sure sensing something. It was scaring the hell out of him. And I was just afraid I was going to walk into a cloaked Bigfoot, bump right into this thing, even though I was really skeptical about it. I didn't walk to the road, couldn't see anything up and down the road, across the road, nothing. Went back, got my dog out from under the trailer, sat down at the campfire, and we weren't sitting for 3 minutes, and all of a sudden my dog gets up, and if I'm sitting at 12 o'clock, my dog gets up and starts staring at a bush about 90 feet away from me at 1 o'clock. And he sticks his nose up in the air again. But this time, instead of 5 minutes, it wasn't 15 seconds. He brought his head down and started lashing out again and growling and snarling and snapping aggressively. And when that happened, the bush 90 feet away from us started rattling. And I heard this and my butt puckered a little bit, and my dog kept being in attack mode, and repeated growls kept going on. So for the first time, and the only time I've ever done this on an expedition, I went to my truck and I carry a .45 Smith & Wesson, got it out of my glove compartment and chambered around. And no sooner the round chambered and you heard this click, everything fell silent. The bushes stopped rattling, the growling stopped, and my dog stopped going apeshit. And it was all over from there. We stayed up for another 15 minutes, but it was pretty intimidating because that bush, 90 feet sounds a long way away, but it's really not when you got these big bushes rattling you and something growling at you from behind it. I've heard bears growl in this area. They've also got a couple big cats, and I've heard big cats growl, and this certainly was neither of those. That was probably my first Class B encounter, although, again, I was never able to visually see the Bigfoot, but I can't imagine what else it was.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
I am curious how, and I do recognize that there are different ways that people see him, like you're saying, materializing. And there's got to be some explanation for not being more sightings, right? I can sort of follow that train of thought that he can come and go and dematerialize. But like you, I'm skeptical. Do you think that's the answer, or are they just so like camouflage out there that they can stay quiet and still?
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is, honestly. The purpose of my book is to introduce psychologic science and scientific experimentation into the field. All we're doing, I shouldn't say all, but the primary research being done is observational. Go out and try and see a Bigfoot, find a print, cast a print, get a recording. And the second part of my book is about how to apply experimental design and statistical analysis to these Bigfoot phenomena to show how they're made by a Bigfoot rather than a human or some other creature. Certainly the flesh and blood schools are getting most of the investigation through Jeff Meldrum, who is, one of the biggest names, if not the biggest name in Bigfoot research. If you're not familiar with him, he's a morphological anthropologist, and he's the one examining and validating these footprints as Bigfoot prints rather than bear prints and other things like that based on the casts and the evidence in the prints. So the flesh and blood school of thought and theory has been probably the most thoroughly investigated. But when you look at those investigations, they don't go very much further than just trying to capture a picture or get a recording or get a cast. That's posted online or wherever. And then the big debate starts, people debating about, yeah, that's authentic. No, that's not authentic. If it was this, if it was that. And the thing about experimental design and statistical analysis is the numbers will give us the answers. The statistical analysis will give us the answers from the experiment, so we don't have to rely as much on personal opinion and bias. I think we need more data. I think we need to investigate some of these paranormal and woo experiences. I think we need to bring science to bear. For example, one of the phenomena is mind speak. It's believed that Bigfoots can telepathically communicate with each other and humans. And people frequently report this telepathic communication. I've met a lot of people who have. Believe it or not, that movie, The Men Who Stared at Goats, where you had to school to learn all these telekinetic abilities and stuff, there's actually a brick and mortar building outside of Washington, D.C. that certifies psychics. The experiment I have in mind is getting somebody who's a certified psychic and having them request, say, in Bigfoot research, frequently something used as a gifting station, which is just a general area where people leave food or other gifts for the Bigfoot to take and hope to get some kind of gift back from them. Using a gifting station and first asking Bigfoot to bring you like a pine cone, something that commonly occurs in the forest and is easily acceptable, but asking this telepathically, see if it brings back a pine cone. Next, ask it for something one level more complicated up. How about bringing us some deer antlers or a deer skull? Next step up is something that they might find in a campground, but doesn't necessarily naturally occur in the forest. Bring us some children's toys, a children's dolly, because kids sometimes when they're camping, they leave the dollies lay around all over the place. And then finally, the last instruction being asking them to bring us, and this is the dicey one, asking them to bring us something from somebody's house, like a statue. I've met people who these things have come into their house and moved rocks and statues in the middle of the night. And so asking the Bigfoot to gift us something from inside of somebody's house and see how many hits we get. It's a progressively more difficult thing. If there's Bigfoots doing this, it's a progressively more difficult thing for them to get. And then just statistically analyze the hits versus misses to take a look at whether the telepathy is being received and answered by the Bigfoot through the gifts that they bring back. So that's one idea I have about testing telepathy, or woo. In the Bigfoot community, these phenomena are called woo. One of the other things attributed to Bigfoot is something called zapping. Are you familiar with infrasound?
A little bit familiar with that, yeah.
So elephants, this was first, I think, discovered in elephants. A herd 10 miles apart, when they trumpet or roar, they send infrasound through the ground 10 miles underground, and the other herd can pick up on that infrasound through the pads of their feet. And that's how elephants communicate with each other across distances. And it's so prevalent to the point that Zookeepers who work with elephants, they can't stay working with elephants more than a couple, 3 months. They've got to rotate someone new in because this infrasound creates all kinds of physical ailments, nausea, headaches, vomiting, visual problems. And it's truly the effects of that low frequency vibration affecting the body of humans. And so I developed a lab experiment where we could do a placebo-controlled experiment where we would present people either with infrasound roar or a Bigfoot roar without infrasound in it and measure their stress levels with biologic markers as well as psychologic markers. One group gets the infrasound condition first and then the placebo control. And another group gets a placebo control first and then the infrasound to kind of counterbalance the order effects of the presentation, measuring stress hormones and that kind of thing to see if, in fact, it's the infrasound causing people's autonomic nervous system to go awry and have all these autonomic reactivity responses, fainting, dizziness, freezing, or is it us psyching ourselves out because we think it's a Bigfoot? And that's where the placebo control group comes in. So these are some examples of some of the kind of experiments I'm advocating to get away from basing validity on opinions and phallus swinging rather than scientific numbers.
With the experiment where you give the gifts and you have put the thought out there, the psychic thought out there to the Bigfoot to bring something back, the object that's brought back, do you ever test that for DNA or anything like that?
I never included that in the experiment. That's certainly not in the experiment that's written up in the book. Well, actually, that one isn't even in my book. That's just one I've been kicking around in my head. No, the thought hadn't occurred to me, and let me explain probably why. As you guys maybe know, there's been no DNA study that has successfully documented a Bigfoot. The DNA studies done in other countries has always come back some other kind of terrestrial species. Melba Ketchum did a big DNA study here in the United States, but it was methodologically flawed and ethically flawed. She ended up having to buy her own journal to get her DNA study published. That study is in ill repute. Now, I understand she has got a study going. We were talking about the 911 guy or 411 guy. What was his name?
Yeah, David Paulides.
He's involved in a group doing a DNA study as well. What makes it tough with the DNA studies is you can't duplicate a full genome just from its hair. You've got to get flesh and blood to get both the female and male components to form a complete genome. And so that's one of the big obstacles with Bigfoot. In humans, for example, our complete DNA is held within our hair follicle. That's not the way it is with Bigfoots. It's only partial DNA in the hair follicle, and you got to get flesh and blood to get the rest. I'm not real big on DNA studies. One, because they're very expensive to do. An analysis of DNA is outrageous, very time-consuming, very problematic in a lot of different ways. It's as close to a scientific investigation as we've had, but that's not something I think the average Bigfoot researcher can pursue on their own. Recently, a young man out of England, Daniel, I'm blocking on his last name, he got a team together in England and ended up finding ancient ape environmental DNA in a forest in London. But the problem with environmental DNA is, again, you can't get a complete genome from it. You can only get the gender of one parent. So unless you have tons of money, and even the environmental DNA analyses can be pretty pricey. His was donated by the company who did it. It's very pricey. It's very labor intensive. Lots of steps can contaminate and make things difficult. So I'm not a big fan of DNA. One of the other reasons is even if, let's say we get some bodies, let's say we find a carcass, let's not talk about killing them, but we find a carcass, one Bigfoot carcass may not be enough to prove definitively Bigfoot exists. It could just only serve as the baseline. We probably need a second Bigfoot carcass to compare across carcasses for replication purposes in the scientific method. But secondly, once we've dissected a Bigfoot and looked at its anatomy and physiology, that's still not going to allow us to attribute all these phenomena to Bigfoot, because for the most part, no one's ever seen Bigfoot create these phenomena, the footprints, the tree knocks, the howls. There are few people who claim to have seen tree knocks, and a few people who've claimed to have seen howls, and them walking, of course, the Patterson-Gimlin film. Are you guys familiar with that? Yeah. The Patterson-Gimlin film clearly shows a Bigfoot walking in that creek bed. Rarely do you see it, but from that same encounter, I'm not sure whether it was Gimlin or Patterson, after all the excitement died down, they took their horse on horseback and walked right beside the full length of Bigfoot tracks and videoed that whole trackway. And it occasionally pops up on social media. And then they cast those prints. And so we've got, from the Patterson-Gimlin film, we've got still footage, we've got video footage, we've got pictures of footprints, we've got casts of footprints, we've got self-reports of those two guys, and still none of that was considered scientific enough for science to say, yeah, Bigfoot exists as a species. And I think part of it is it's all observational. The language of science is math. And so this is why I think if we're going to convince science of Bigfoot existence, we need to begin to do some experimental design and statistical analysis and let the numbers tell us rather than personal opinions. Kind of lost track of what I'm talking about or what the question is at this point. Did I answer your question, Lance?
Yes, you definitely answered the question, and you filled in a lot of color there that, answers future questions that I had, so I appreciate it.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
I know your book is about going on searches, but there's a big focus on safety, and you even have a legal disclaimer in here that's like several pages long. So I guess my question is, do you think Bigfoot is dangerous?
The legal disclaimer in there is for two reasons. One, in my book, I teach how to use self-hypnosis to regulate your fight-flight response. So in the face of a big Class A where you're face-to-face with a Bigfoot, you can remain calm and not poop and pee in your pants, because that happens to a lot of people. And if you can stay calm enough, once they move off, you can continue to investigate rather than running off yourself. So one of the reasons for the disclaimer is all these psychological techniques that are in my book that I pass on to the layman, if you will, psychological layman. But the other reason is, well, even the expeditions that are most benign, let's put it this way, bad things happen. You do most of the investigation out in the woods at night, and you're wearing typically a red headlamp to cast light onto the ground. Well, that only casts so much light. And I've been on expeditions where people have fallen. I've fallen on an expedition traipsing through the woods myself, no damage. I've been on an expedition where somebody tripped in a hole at the base camp and broke their ankle and had to be taken to a hospital as a result of that. So besides all the peril that Mother Nature herself can throw at you, snakes, bears, slippery slopes. You got a lot of dangers with nature, potentially dangers with Bigfoot. Again, depending on who you talk to in Texas, I understand they've got a lot of aggressive Bigfoots. No one in the Georgia area that I've ever heard of has been aggressed upon. But up in Alaska, I understand that they can also be aggressive as well. So I kind of subscribe to the notion that, like humans, We got goodies and baddies and people that act out and people that don't. I think it's probably similar with Bigfoots. Not to say that I think they're human. I think environmental factors play a role in how aggressive they might be. I think in areas where food supply is lower and they live in more isolated areas, I think they're going to tend to be more aggressive than in more heavily, densely human populated areas. But again, that just represents yet another empirical question that needs to be answered through science, I think.
Now, we have you here and you have a bunch of stories and you're eager to tell some of the more harrowing ones. Can you give us one of the more harrowing Bigfoot encounter stories?
I'll tell you my most harrowing personal story. This was like on my second expedition. When we go out on night ops, you break out into small groups and you go to specific locations based on that small group expedition's leaders' plans for the night. We were going to this area. There was 15 of us in the group. As a group, we hiked to this cabin that was built as when the Civil War was just starting. Back then, the draft was called consignment rather than the draft. And this guy didn't want to be consigned to the Civil War, so he went up into the Tennessee mountains and built a cabin way up isolated in the mountains to hide and avoid consignment. You can get into this cabin and use it, although I think they're doing maintenance on it last time I heard. So all 15 of us went like halfway up this mountain, forged 2 or 3 streams to get to solid ground, and halfway up this mountain, and met together. And then we divided it into smaller groups. And one of the smaller groups of 4 was to go further down the mountain and scout around that area. I was a member of one of 2 groups that was going to hike up this deer trail, and one of us was supposed to take a left, the other was supposed to take a right, and we were going to meet in the middle on this fire road on the backside of the mountain. And then a group of 3 stayed at the cabin kind of to hold down base camp. So it had been raining the night before, so the ground was slippery. We scurried, 4 of us, Dan Kegley, Mark Ogilvie, George Wrigley, and myself was our group of 4. And we hiked up this deer trail, really steep and slippery deer trail, to get to a fire road. And we started walking up this unkempt fire road. The grass on it hadn't been cut. And no sooner we start walking up the fire road, all we heard was silence. People say, that things get silent when Bigfoot is in the area. And all we could hear was rain trickling off the mountain and the leaves rustling in the breeze when it blew. It rarely happened, but I was in the lead. I guess I must have been excited. I was in the front spot walking up this hill. I'm overweight and out of shape, so it's pretty rare that I would be in the front. I'd usually be bringing up the back. As I'm walking up, I say to George Wrigley, I said, George, you hear this silence? Is this the kind of silence you expect when there's a Bigfoot in the area? And he said, well, the silence fits, but usually when it's this silent and there's a Bigfoot in the area, you can get that, he called it the spidey tingling sense. The hairs on your neck start standing up on the back of your neck, and you get this sense you're being watched. And nobody in the group was having that sense or reporting it. So he was saying, I just think it's, after the storms we've been having. But you couldn't hear tree frogs. You couldn't hear chipmunks or squirrels scurrying in the leaves. Nothing. Dead silent. We keep hiking, and we don't see any signs of wildlife. And after about 2 hours of hiking, we're like, when the hell are we going to run into this other group coming from the other direction? Took us a while to get in touch with them through the walkie-talkies. We finally got a hold of them. Somehow, one of us took a wrong turn, we discovered, and we were never going to connect up with them. But they told us the direction they went. They spooked roosting turkey from the trees. They had turkey on the ground. They had deer. They ran into some deer. They had signs of wild pigs rooting on the road. They had all kinds of wildlife sign, and we had none, not even tree frogs croaking or crickets. And so when we discovered that we'd never connect with them, we started back down this trail. For some reason, all three of these guys, I'm a clinical hypnotherapist. And so I would use hypnosis to work with my PTSD patients and that kind of thing. They like to hear me talk about hypnosis, self-hypnosis or unintentional hypnosis, be contributing to some people's encounters and enhancing those. So we were talking about that. I made some point. I was in second out of four of us. And after I made this sentence, George Wrigley was in front of me. Dan Kegley was behind me. And the other guy was behind him, Mark Ogleby. When I made some comment, George stopped dead, pivoted on his heel, and covered about 3 feet back to me and said, J. He just got out the consonant of my first name, John, and there was a tree pushover that absolutely sounded like a bomb going off above our heads. I mean, like a bomb. It was massive. And immediately following this bomb going off, you could hear what sounded like a landslide. If you've ever seen like rocks tumble down a mountain or logs tumble down a mountain or heard them, they'll roll for a while, they'll hit a big rock, get airborne, and it gets a little quieter until it hits. Well, it was that kind of cadence, but it extended probably 25 yards in front of us and behind us. So when that tree went off and what we thought was a landslide coming down on top of us, George and I ran down the trail one way. Mark Ogleby, the guy bringing up the rear, ran back up the trail the other way. And then Dan Kegley, it was his first expedition. He went for his K-bar knife, getting ready to pull it and pivot it and looked uphill and was in the ready position to fight what was ever coming down the hill. I was expecting rocks and logs because I thought it was a landslide. Needless to say, that made all our butts pucker because we never experienced anything like that. And then we spent 30 minutes trying to debunk it. Not the first log, pebble, nothing from above the mountain came down to the fire road except this massive cloud of loam. Are you familiar with what loam smells like? It's kind of like the soil. If you have a compost pile and you mix up your compost and everything decays, it has a distinctive smell. And I smelled it first, and then I looked up the mountain, and when I shined my light up the mountain, you could see these particles of loam dust coming down on top of us. So we tried to debunk it, try and figure out, could it have just been a tree? The landslide sound lasted 14 seconds. We've got a recording of it, 14 seconds after the tree pop, the tree being pushed over. So after all that happened, the guy, because we were near the cabin, we were near that deer trail to go back down. The guys from the cabin called up, "Did you hear that tree push over?" It was like, no crap, buddy. I mean, it was like a bomb going off right in front of us. If you heard it, we most certainly heard it. So we spent a half hour, 45 minutes trying to debunk it, but we couldn't find any kind of evidence one way or another. So before we went to walk the rest of the way to the deer trail and down the deer trail, we put 2 sticks forming an X, stuck them in the ground vertically to mark the spot where this happened. And we started walking down the fire road to the deer trail. As we're walking down the fire road to the deer trail, these guys at the cabin radio us up again and say, "Are you walking down the fire road or the deer trail?" "We're walking down the fire road." "Okay, 10-4. And that's all they said. Then we get to the deer trail. It's, you could have slid down it on your butt easier than you could walk down it. So we're gingerly making our way down this deer trail. And the guys with the walkie-talkies come on again. "Are you guys walking on the fire road or down the deer trail?" "And we're on the deer trail now. Why do you keep radioing us?" "Well, when you were on the fire road, about 30 yards behind you, we saw some red eye shine or orbs following you down the fire road. And now that you're on the deer trail, we're seeing those red orbs or eye shine following you down the deer trail. So we, of course, all pivoted and looked up and couldn't find a thing. We get down to the cabin, and now all the groups are gathered. So there's a total of 15 people there. And we're just resting up until we hike back down the rest of the mountain and ford those 3 streams to get to where we parked our cars. And all of a sudden, somebody in the group says, "Look at that." Somebody else distant from them said, "Yeah, look at that." And it took me a while to see what they were pointing at. What they were seeing were these little red eyeballs popping out from behind a tree, going back, and then popping out the other side of the tree. It's called peekaboo in Bigfoot nomenclature. All of a sudden, that was happening within like a 50-yard stretch of forest. Multiple, 15, 20 juveniles or infants. It was anywhere from 1 foot off the ground to 3 foot off the ground. You were seeing these eyeballs peek out from behind a tree and then the other side and just keep going like that. No adult ever stepped out and kind of just stood there and surveyed things. So 15 of us watched that for about 20 to 25 minutes. These infants and juveniles just playing peekaboo with us. And then it finally stopped. We went back to base camp, our true base camp. We had intentions of going back up the next morning to where we left the X's crossed. But although I was the oldest one in the group, the other group members weren't too far behind me. So we were all stiff and sore and could barely walk the next morning. So some young guy, fresh out of the Army, deer hunter, he goes up there, he finds where we left the X, and I'll be darned if he doesn't find a footprint, a big footprint. He rushes back down and comes into our true base camp, gets somebody who knows how to make casts, and they went up and they cast this footprint. While they're waiting for the footprint to cure, the cast to cure, they start looking around for other Bigfoot sign. Well, all we did that night before, because the landslide sound or bluff charge sound came like from the mountain above us down, we never thought to look over the other side of the drop-off of the forest road. While they're waiting for the cast to cure, they looked at the drop-off side of the road, and right on the berm or right on the edge of it, they found a partial adult print that they couldn't cast, and 15 foot up the tree, there was a fresh tree bark tear. And then when they looked down over that ledge, about 10 feet down, it leveled out into a muddy flat, like a ledge further down, full of mud. They said they counted between 30 and 40 infant and juvenile Bigfoot prints. So in hindsight, what we kind of think happened, but I think we accidentally stopped by either the nursery or the playground, and mom and or dad were trying to shoo us away, first with a tree pushover and then a bluff charge, and then got the family together and came down to stare at us for a while at base camp. When I saw that's the first authentic, and by authentic I mean raw Bigfoot foot cast I've seen. I've seen replications, but I've never seen a first generation cast. And it was just incredible. It was 17 and a half inches long, I think about 7 inches wide. You could see the joints and the bones in all the toes, except the great toe, which there was a bone joint missing, but you could see the great toe where the bone should have been, and then the next bone connecting it to the foot. And you could see all the dermal ridges, the mid-tarsal break. And so it was incredible to see. I didn't poop or pee my pants. I can't explain how loud of a bomb. We're not talking an M80 or one stick of dynamite here. We're talking, it sounded like a massive bomb going off in front of, above our heads.
You were sort of a believer after that, it sounds like.
Those two stories are as close as I've come to a Class A encounter, but they would be considered Class B because we clearly couldn't identify the form of a Bigfoot. Scott Carpenter, unfortunately, has passed. He's died. One of the lessons that I got from his book in looking at all these photographic plates is there's a lot of scary non-Bigfoot creatures roaming our freaking woods, because a lot of those images in that book look nothing like a Bigfoot and look something like a monster out of a monster movie. So there are experiences to be had, for better or worse.
Well, Dr. John, thank you so much for spending some time with us here today. That was really interesting stuff. And where is the best place for our listeners to get your new book?
It's available on Amazon, either the Untold Radio Network website or the publication arm of the Untold Radio is Hangar One Publications, and it's available on either of those sites.
Amazing. And I feel like there's so much more that we need to discuss with you, so we have to have you give a verbal commitment that you'll join us again sometime soon and go into more on your experiments and your scientific approach to researching Bigfoot.
Absolutely. I'd love to. When I wrote the book, I thought this was going to be a groundbreaking, change the way everybody did research. It hasn't changed a damn thing. I think people have gotten comfortable in just going out and looking and taking pictures and recording, but I would love to come back and get into more detail about that and some other stories. Absolutely. Thank you.